welcome to this series of lectures on modern European history. We have earlier spoken about the background of the beginning of what in syllabi across universities in India is taught as modern European history, effectively beginning with the French Revolution, or you can say even the Industrial Revolution in England, and the way it goes on all across the 19th century, finally culminating in 20th century with the Second World War. This particular lecture is about Napoleonic reforms, and this is part 2. This is the sequel to an earlier discussion that we have had about Napoleonic reforms 1. Now, these 1 and 2 nomenclatures are entirely for our convenience, just to package it into different lectures. There is no original classificatory distinction between the two. Broadly, what we would be talking about in this discussion is the way the reforms in the sectors of law, education, centralization, administration through bureaucracy, careers being thrown open to talent, etc., that had already been introduced in France by Napoleon. How, when Napoleon embarks on empire building post 1804 and brings quite a few areas outside France also under the administration of France directly, or by appointing his own men as rulers in these areas under some kind of a tutelage of Napoleon, how even in those areas these reform principles got permeated, not merely because of their chance of being a part of Napoleonic empire, but also conscious effort on part of Napoleon to push through these reforms even in these areas in some way or the other, by buttressing the people who clamored for these reforms, progressive reforms in these newly acquired areas politically, by lending them some kind of political support. So, that essentially is what we shall be talking about in this segment of our lecture. To begin with, as you can see on your slide, let's do a detour of the anti-French alliances that the revolutionary France had seen, and it is only in the backdrop of this that Napoleon's overtures with relation to his empire building program can make better sense. So, 1792 to 95 is the period of the largely it coincides with the period when France is at war with the neighboring states. This is also the second phase of the revolution, and Napoleon at this moment is part of the French army and fighting these enemies. The first alliance that was formed was amongst Britain, Austria and Prussia, and they fought against France, or in fact France had to fight against these powers when France actually went to war with the neighboring states during the reign of terror, or during the Jacobin dominance period. And eventually a treaty of Campo Formio was signed in 1797 with Austria, and Austria, having to sign this treaty with France, represented a major boost to the morale of French army, and Napoleon was instrumental in this, because it is Austria from where most of the emigres were operating, most of the counter-revolutionary power and money and thrust was coming from Austria. That's where they had settled, because Austria also had the monarchical system, which had family connection with the Bourbons, right. 1798, Britain forms a second coalition with Russia and Austria. This is again against France. However, there is not much that flowed out of it, meaning thereby that neither Britain nor France could decisively get beaten or decisively won against each other. So eventually, now for France it was a big thing that despite taking on Britain, there was not much harm that could be done to French territorial sovereignty, and it could retain whatever areas that were in its command, and this was one of the factors for the kind of clout and prestige that was bestowed upon Napoleon, because he was so central to this. So, in the event of this coalition resulting into nothingness, resulting into inconclusive consequences, Russia withdrew from this, and the next big international effort that we get to see is in 1801, where Austria and France signed the Treaty of Lunéville. Now, this Treaty of Lunéville in 1801 is just a reconfirmation of the provisions of Campo Formio, which was signed earlier, as we spoke about it, with Austria. And whatever provisions that had been made as a result of this treaty, for example, Belgium and the area that lay left to the Rhine River was to go to France. Republics established by Napoleon out of the territories of the Low Countries. Low Countries would mean the present day the Netherlands, Holland area. So, those areas and Switzerland and Italy and Piedmont were legitimized, meaning thereby whoever was in power in these areas acknowledged the presence and formidable presence of Napoleon. So, it informally worked as part of his imperial system. The German map was redrawn because the semi-independent states under French domination were all amalgamated as the Confederation of Rhine. So, very smaller polities that earlier were semi-independent states under France. There was some kind of a formal reorganization of that, and they all were reorganized as Confederation of the Rhine. Confederation would mean a federated structure where the federating units have the right to secede. That's the technical meaning of confederation. So, it's a loose kind of federation that we mean here. So, that the earlier German area that were all scattered as semi-independent states, they were all brought together as an amalgamated confederation of the Rhine. And eventually in 1802, and by this time Napoleon was fast consolidating his position as a dictator, although technically he was just the first consul, and it is only in 1804 that he crowns himself as the emperor, and this we have already discussed in the earlier part of the lecture. So, by 1802, Britain had realized that it couldn't take on France all alone, because Austria had withdrawn, Russia had withdrawn. So, Britain also wanted to settle it with France, and it did in 1802 by returning all the captured overseas territories of France that it had come to acquire over a period of time back to France, except Trinidad and Ceylon, the present day Sri Lanka. So, these areas, Trinidad and Ceylon, barring these areas, all other overseas territories that Britain had come to acquire from or come to conquer from France, they were given back to France, and that is how a peace was arrived at. Now, coming back to the Napoleonic reforms in areas outside France, because we have earlier discussed that having embarked upon the journey of creating an empire, various areas outside France were made part of the French Empire under Napoleon, and some were allowed to operate as independent states, all right, but it was all under some appointed authority by Napoleon himself. So, all those areas did see for the first time the freshness of several new things that the French Revolution had brought to France. For example, rule of law, for example, modern education system, for example, modern bureaucratic system of administration, for example, careers being thrown open to talent and not being the exclusive preserve of the top orders, right, and high positions in army not being sold to the highest bidders, rather going to the most deserving person who had all the attributes and requirements, and that is what we mean by merit here. So, all these things that were very germane to the revolutionized France got a chance to permeate across the empire, and in the process several groups, several social segments outside France were very much taken by it, were very much appreciative of this. They looked at these things with a sense of future of their own country. They wanted this kind of a system. So, what we mean here is that although it was militarily brought under French domination, these areas, nevertheless, the charm of these progressive ideas had enraptured, had captured the imagination of quite a few sections of people in different areas of Europe. Now, they started clamoring for such changes even when Napoleonic Empire was a story of past in their countries. Post 1815, it is these very areas and groups of people who became the harbingers of modernity in their own areas. They had to undertake a long struggle to get it for their countries. So, in this way, Napoleon is the harbinger of these ideas and reforms in the newly acquired territories under Napoleonic Empire. Particularly, as you can see on your slide, the Central European territories got fairly revolutionized by these ideas through governmental reorganization, by imposing major egalitarian reforms while building a French empire. So, say the rule of law, say the administrative reforms, say the new educational system that was put in place, all these things were or all these things did find some kind of a social constituency in these areas. And these egalitarian reforms got a fertile soil, particularly in Central European territories, the harvest of which obviously could be made only subsequently. It took many decades for these areas to actually win it for their own countries as a future system of governance in their areas, even when the French control was gone. Italy was reorganized as the Kingdom of Italy under Napoleonic Empire. Similarly, Germany was organized, or the German areas were organized as the Confederation of the Rhine, which we have already spoken of earlier, and also Kingdom of Westphalia. These are the nomenclatures that were in currency during the Napoleonic period. Dalmatia was organized as the Illyrian provinces, same for Holland, and Belgium was directly integrated into the empire. So, it was Belgium did not have an identity of its own in the Napoleonic period. It was directly governed by France from Paris under Napoleon. Now, administration in these areas which had no semblance of modernity or equality before law, etc., for the first time saw how these principles were at work in the new administrative setup. So, these areas for the first time saw as to what it means to have equality before law, what it means to have careers being open to talent and not being left for sale or being the exclusive preserve of a few aristocratic families or some persons with deep purse. Similarly, as it had happened in France in the post-revolutionary period, particularly under Napoleon, you have abolition of ancient customs and privileges happening even in areas outside France, merely because it was part of Napoleonic Empire. So, just because of the administrative connectedness that their areas had with the Napoleonic Empire, these changes automatically flowed in, right, and they do not require some kind of an ingenuous effort to bring this about. Obviously, this was not an all-time gift that was given by France to these areas. Once Napoleonic period was over, obviously there was tumultuous situation in these areas, and these areas relapsed into the earlier ways after the Congress of Vienna in 1814, 1815. Nevertheless, a ground had already been created in these areas which went on to consolidate, or which went on to become the focal point of resistance against the old order. So, abolition of ancient customs and privileges, manorial courts getting liquidated, church courts getting abolished, all these things happened in these areas as well, merely because they were part of the Napoleonic Empire, right. So, the point is that the areas outside France also experienced it, modernity, just because they were part of the Napoleonic Empire. Provinces joined in an enormous bureaucratic network that reached back to Paris. Codification of law, these several European areas did not know much about it, because they had centuries old history of monarchical order and absolutism or serfdom and so forth. So codified laws, they saw for the first time during the Napoleonic phase, and that too at work. The tax system that was very modernized at the behest of Napoleon, that was also made visible to these people in these areas, and they had a first hand experience of a modernized tax system at work. And this had nothing to do with feudalism. It was entirely through modern sensibilities on the basis of citizenship and not on the basis of states or something. So immunity was not granted in terms of someone's family pedigree or royal pedigree for taxation. Individuals could work as per their choice. Again, a marker, a political and economic marker of modernity, that also became visible to these areas for the first time, merely because they were part of the Napoleonic Empire. However, one thing that was denied, and that's very glaring, is that despite all these democratic inroads and individualism and modern governance principles, taxation, education and so forth, no freedom of having local self-government was given to these areas outside France, because the directions were to come directly from Paris, say Napoleon the dictator. Right. So, in that sense, they were all part of Napoleonic Empire, and there was an assertion from above that we get to see. Napoleon is charged of sounding very haughty when he made this statement. The Romans gave their laws to their allies. Why should not France have hers adopted in Holland? So it is the Napoleonic code that he wants to propagate and institute in areas outside France also. And he quotes the Roman history, that if Romans could do it in past, what is it that should stop France from doing it? Just to win adherence and admiration of his reforms, the way Romans had done it in a civilizational complex. Beethoven, the famous music composer, who was so eager a supporter of the French Revolution when it began, and had a lot of expectations from Napoleon as well. Once he saw Napoleon embarking on the imperial project and sounding more haughty and so forth, he revoked his famous composition Erotica that he had dedicated to Napoleon to begin with, saying, now he too will trample on the rights of man and indulge only in ambitions. So there is some kind of a meltdown, there is some kind of a U-turn by the kind of international support that, or the international positivity that Napoleon had gripped France into once he embarked on the principle of imperial conquest. So, to sum up, there were quite a few mistakes that Napoleon perhaps made. For example, his failure of the continental system that he had initiated in 1806 merely to strangulate the commercial power of Britain, whereas Britain fended it well, and in 1807 it came with continental blockade system to checkmate France, and France had to supply to its areas essential commodities through overland, and the supremacy that Britain had overseas actually worked to Britain's advantage, and there wasn't much that could be yielded on account of continental system that Napoleon had undertaken. So that was one mistake. Second was the growing self-importance, the haughty ways in which he started sounding as an emperor and so forth. His empire was modeled after the Roman Empire, the paintings, architecture, furniture, designs, clothing. they all had the pretense of almost like the Roman Empire, and that did not win him much admiration. Imperial and dynastic sensibilities and attitude that he showed made his brothers and sisters monarchs in the conquered areas. He himself married for the second time, his first wife perhaps not being able to produce a child, so he went for the second marriage to secure a successor, and this marriage was into the house of the Habsburgs, again a monarchical family, and he had a child from there who he wanted to succeed him. It is said that Napoleonic Empire was more big and efficient than the Romans, and the sheer fact that it was more efficient, therefore whatever consequences that negative consequences that flowed out of it also could mean that it became more dangerous because it was more efficient on account of vast network of bureaucracy and the sheer organized way in which administration was carried out. But this is not to say that Napoleon did not have positive legacies. For example, the legal code, the centralized bureaucracy, policing system, educational system, the principles of liberty, equality, national identity and sovereignty with the sense of rights and duties. These are some of the lasting contributions that withstood the test of time in European history all across 19th and 20th century. So that goes on to tell us about the contributions and also the mistakes that Napoleon did or Napoleon has so far as even the history of modern Europe is concerned. Thank you.